purpose of doing this eco-column lab was to get a better understanding of the ecosystem and how different ecosystems interact with each other. One thing that is present is the water cycle, with the water that we poured into the soil to water our plants. When the water is poured into the plants in the terrestrial chamber, it simulates precipitation. And when the water gets transpired out of plants, the water goes bye-bye, Jennifer Nett. She said that. When the water gets poured into the plants, it would eventually end up at the bottom of the eco-column in the aquatic chamber, which simulates water runoff. In the filter chamber, it filters out large bits of sediment or anything else in the terrestrial chamber that is too large to fit between the sand molecules. The filter chamber still allows the water and its nutrients to pass through the aquatic chamber. In the aquatic chamber, we had a bunch of aquatic plants, and we were supposed to have a shark, or have a fish, but I wanted a shark. Brunette said no. The aquatic plants receive their nutrients from the terrestrial chamber when the water is poured in, which helps simulate the nutrient cycle. This lab showed how different ecosystems work together and how we simulated different cycles such as the water cycle and the nutrient cycle.
All right, this is our diagram. We have our plants right here, biotic factor. We have our dead leaves, which is technically a biotic factor. We have our soil, which is abiotic. We have our sand, which is abiotic. We have our water, which is abiotic. We have our aquatic plants, which are biotic, and our rocks are abiotic.
Alright, so in our graph, our first graph, we have our plant growth. As you can see, we had 2 plants that kind of, sprouted up, but then our bottom 3 plants, they didn't grow at all. And that is because of both nutrients, like not reaching them, and planting them too deep into the ground.
All right, we have our soil pH. So, the soil pH kind of varied. It decreased, and then it would increase again, and then it decreased after that. You can see that because of the glare. You cannot see shit, okay. And the soil pH would increase and decrease based on the amount of nutrients traveling from the plants down to the soil.
The changes in the soil fertility, such as it, going down a little bit and spiking back up and kind of leveling back out, is also because of the nutrients and available nutrients for when we both pour the water in and the nutrients in the soil.
And our water pH. Since our eco-column is vertical, the soil pH will just run off into the water chamber, therefore affecting the water pH.
Alright, this one, pretty self-explanatory. Soil temperature, you kept it in a room. The room temperature stayed relatively the same. Therefore, the temperature of the soil will stay relatively the same.
Our dissolved oxygen, you can see the increase in dissolved oxygen because of the oxygen output of the plants. Nope.
Here we have our water nitrates and nitrites. It stayed at 0 the whole time because we didn't put a fish in our eco column. We wanted a shark, but we got shut down. Alright, for our analysis questions. Our first question was to propose 3 possible reasons why there are such large differences between the eco columns. The 3 differences can be the amount of light, the different types of seeds we use, and the amount of leaves. Question number 2 was to identify and briefly discuss the biogeochemical cycles that are taking place, which are present in our eco column. The 4 cycles present were carbon, nitrogen, water, and phosphorus cycle. In the phosphorus cycle, it is present through the plants taking phosphorus out of the soil, and when the plants die, the decomposers recover the phosphorus in the dead plants. When the phosphorus is back in the soil, it leaches through the aquatic chamber where it is picked up by aquatic plants. The water cycle is present through the water being poured into the terrestrial chamber as it would transpire into the plants and run off into the aquatic chamber. The carbon cycle is present through plants releasing carbon into the soil when they die, plants absorbing carbon through transpiration, decomposers bringing carbon back in, and the aquatic plants releasing carbon into the water. The nitrogen cycle is present through the nitrogen being soaked in the soil through the plants and water as the worm absorbs it through the matter we were feeding them. Third question is our ecosystem a closed or open system? our ecosystem was an open system. The fact that it's an open system influences the eco-column because we put water into it, which helps keep the plants alive, as well as bring nutrients from the soil into the aquatic chamber. Question number 4 was 5 limiting factors. 5 limiting factors include the amount of space in the aquatic chamber for the aquatic plants to grow, the amount of light available for the terrestrial chamber, the amount of water poured into the terrestrial chamber, organic matter put into the terrestrial chamber, and the temperature of the soil when it's plant growth. Question number 5 is explain what eutrophication refers to and how this occurs in the eco-column. Eutrophication occurs when excessive richness of nutrients in a lake or other body of water. In the eco-column, we poured too much water into the terrestrial chamber. That led to runoff and increased nutrients ending up in the aquatic chamber, which led to more algae growing, and when the algae died, it led to a decrease in dissolved oxygen in the aquatic chamber. Explain how leaching could occur in your eco-column. Leaching occurs in eco-column when we poured water into the terrestrial chamber and the nutrients ran down the filter chamber and eventually ended up in the aquatic chamber. Leaching in our eco-column led to more nutrients in the aquatic chamber with our aquatic plants and less available for the worms in the terrestrial chamber. What evidence of ecological succession was taking place in eco-column? There was no ecological succession present. If there was, it could be present in the plants dying and the other plants rebuilding plant society. If they were rebuilt and plant society would be great again. What biome does your eco-column closely resemble? An eco-column closely resembles the rainforest because we gave it a lot of water.
Okay. The purpose of doing this eco-column lab was to get a better understanding of the ecosystem and how different ecosystems interact with each other. In this experiment, we measured the different things in our eco-column, such as water and soil temperature, plant growth, and soil and water pH. One of the main surprises in our experiment is the fact that only 2 of our 5 plants grew. It baffles us. 2 plants growing instead of 5 differs from our prediction of 5 growing because of overwatering, as well as planting the seeds too deep in the soil. Our one and only error ever was putting the gummy worm in the eco-column. This occurs because Brunette said I could do it. A potential improvement could have been not to put a gummy worm in the eco-column. The similarities between the eco-column and the real world is that the eco-column shows how nutrients move through the different ecosystems along with the different cycles, such as the water cycle and how they interact. One difference between the eco-column and the real world is that our eco-column, we have more control over the different variables like water, light, and soil. A local ecological problem that is applicable to our research is the lack of biodiversity. We only had a few plants in our terrestrial chamber and we did not have a fish in our aquatic chamber. With limited biodiversity, there was a smaller variety of organisms, which leads to a decrease in breakdown of organic matter, which then leads to a decrease in available nutrients. The national problem could be limited plant space. There was limited space for our plants to grow and they were stuck competing for resources and nutrients to grow. Limiting plant space can lead to I cannot say this. Developmental problems, there we go, for the plants, which can lead to them not growing as much or not growing at all. A global problem can be fertilizer runoff into aquatic ecosystems. Pouring the water into the terrestrial chamber led to us seeing how minerals and nutrients can run off into the aquatic chamber. This shows how real world fertilizer can run off into rivers and lakes and affect the ecosystem. Some resources that I found online that support our findings are Plants in Motion, 360 Yield Center, and agriculture.umass.edu. The next steps that we would take after the completion of our lab would be to conduct other experiments that support our findings individually, such as how nutrients move through soil and affect plant growth, how water quality affects growth in marine plant species, and seed germination. 3 questions that we still have that were not answered in the lab are how a fish would have affected the marine ecosystem if we had one, if worms would have increased the amount of plant growth and seed germination, and why certain species of plants didn't germinate. We would pursue these lines of research while conducting these experiments individually and change the variables of those said experiments. This lab showed how nutrients move through soil and affect other parts of ecosystems, how changes in variables affected the experiment as a whole, and how certain species of plant growth varies on those said variables. And these are bibliography.